The breaking point. The Great Hall of the Galactic Assembly stretched across 3 kilometers of polished metal and crystal. 1,000 different species filled the floating platforms that hung in perfect circles around the central speaking chamber. Some breathed oxygen like humans. Others needed special suits filled with methane or liquid nitrogen. The crystalline delegates from Xerion floated in tanks of superheated plasma, while the hive minds appeared as clusters of insects that moved like living clouds. Ambassador Sarah Chen stood at the central podium, her small human form dwarfed by the massive alien representatives around her. She had been Earth's voice in this place for 8 years. 8 long years of watching the galaxy's greatest governing body turn every crisis into a committee meeting and every emergency into a study group. Behind her, holographic displays showed the evidence she had presented 14 times before. Images of Zephyrian slave ships, records of auction houses where sentient beings were sold like livestock, testimony from escaped slaves who described the horror of their captivity. The proof was overwhelming, undeniable, and heartbreaking. "The motion before the assembly is simple," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the translation devices that converted her words into 1,000 different languages. "The Zephyrian Empire is conducting systematic slavery operations across 12 star systems. Millions of sentient beings from 43 different species are being held against their will. We have provided more than enough evidence to justify immediate action." A low rumble filled the hall as the various delegates communicated among themselves. The Zephyrians themselves sat in their section with smug confidence, their reptilian features showing no concern. They had been through this same process 13 times before and knew exactly how it would end. The current assembly speaker was a Vorthak, a creature that looked like a cross between an octopus and a tree. Its multiple arms waved slowly as it processed the debate through its complex neural network. "The delegate from Earth has made her presentation," it said in a voice that sounded like wind through leaves. "We shall now hear from other assembly members before proceeding to the vote." Sarah bit back her frustration as speaker after speaker rose to address the assembly. The Mindari delegate wanted to form a study committee to examine the cultural implications of intervention. The hegemony representative suggested that slavery might be a traditional practice that outsiders should not judge. The Void Dwellers proposed creating a subcommittee to investigate whether the assembly even had jurisdiction over internal Zephyrian affairs. Hours passed. Sarah had heard these same arguments, these same delays, these same excuses 13 times before. Each time the assembly chose to study the matter further rather than take action. Each time more slaves died while the galaxy's leaders debated. Finally, the voting began. Sarah watched the display boards as each species cast their votes. Red, for action, blue for further study, yellow for abstention. She already knew what the result would be, but she watched anyway, hoping that somehow this time would be different. The final tally appeared on the screens. 312 votes for further study, 298 votes for immediate action, 237 abstentions. Once again, the assembly had chosen bureaucracy over justice. The Vorthak speaker announced the result with what might have been satisfaction in its alien voice. "The motion for immediate intervention is defeated. The matter will be referred to the Committee for External Affairs for continued examination. This assembly session is now concluded." Sarah remained at the podium as delegates began filing out of the hall. Many of them were already discussing dinner plans or their next meetings, the suffering of millions of slaves already forgotten. The Zephyrian delegation passed by her platform, and their leader, a scarred reptile named General Hasek, paused to look at her with yellow eyes full of mockery. "Better luck next cycle, little human," he hissed in accented galactic standard. "Though I suspect you will have the same result then as well." Sarah said nothing. She had learned long ago that responding to such taunts only provided entertainment for creatures like Hasek. Instead, she gathered her materials and walked slowly toward the exit. In the corridor outside the assembly hall, she was joined by Ambassador Jorak of the Keth Confederacy, one of the few alien leaders who had consistently voted for action on the slavery issue. His bear-like features showed genuine sadness. "I am sorry, Sarah," he said, his deep voice heavy with regret. "I had hoped this time would be different." "So did I," Sarah replied quietly. "But hoping does not save lives. Action does. And this assembly seems incapable of action." Jorak nodded slowly. "The system has its flaws, but it has also prevented wars and maintained peace for thousands of years. Sometimes the process is slow, but sometimes slow is the same as never," Sarah interrupted. "How many Zephyrian slaves have died while we have been having these debates? How many children have been sold into bondage while we formed committees? The Keth ambassador had no answer for that. Few of the good-hearted delegates did. They genuinely wanted to help, but they were trapped in a system that valued process over results, procedure over justice. That night, Sarah sat in her quarters aboard the Earth diplomatic vessel, composing what she knew would be her final report to the Earth government. She had been authorized to make this decision if the assembly failed one more time, but the weight of it still pressed down on her shoulders. 3 days later, Sarah returned to the assembly hall for what would be her last appearance as Earth's representative. Word had spread that she was planning to make some kind of announcement, and the hall was more crowded than usual. Even species that normally skipped routine sessions had sent observers. Sarah took her place at the central podium one final time. She looked around at the thousands of alien faces staring down at her, creatures from across the galaxy who had gathered to govern their shared space. For a moment, she felt the weight of history. The assembly had existed for over 4,000 years. No member species had ever voluntarily withdrawn from it. Fellow delegates, she began, her voice steady and clear. I stand before you today to inform the assembly that the human race is formally withdrawing from this confederation, effective immediately. The hall erupted in noise. Some delegates clicked or buzzed or roared their surprise. Others remained silent, perhaps too shocked to react. The Vorthak speaker frantically waved its arms for order. Sarah waited for the chaos to die down before continuing. For 8 years, humanity has tried to work within this system. We have followed your procedures, respected your traditions, and honored your customs. We have brought you problems that demanded urgent solutions and received only promises of future committees. She gestured toward the displays that still showed evidence of the Zephyrian slave trade. 14 times we have asked for your help in ending one of the greatest moral crises of our era. 14 times you have chosen bureaucracy over action, process over justice. We can no longer be part of a system that values paperwork more than sentient lives. The Zephyrian General Hasek rose from his platform, his reptilian features twisted with amusement. You cannot simply leave, little human. No one leaves the assembly. You will be back within a year begging for readmission. Sarah turned to look at him directly. General, you have built an empire on the suffering of others because you knew the assembly would never stop you. You counted on their endless debates and their fear of decisive action. That calculation no longer includes humanity. She turned, back to address the full assembly. We do not leave in anger but in disappointment. The galaxy deserves better leadership than this institution can provide. Perhaps someday you will remember that the purpose of government is to serve and protect, not simply to exist. With that, Sarah Chen walked out of the assembly hall, her footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. Behind her, the greatest governing body in galactic history continued to exist. But for the first time in 4 millennia, it felt smaller. The delegates sat in confused shock, many of them unable to process what had just happened. No species had ever left the assembly voluntarily. Most assumed the humans would change their minds within a few months. After all, where else could they go? They were about to find out. The silence. 6 months after humanity's dramatic exit from the assembly, the galaxy began to notice changes. They were small things at first, the kind of details that most beings overlooked in their daily lives. But like water slowly draining from a bathtub, the absence became more obvious as time passed. On Kepler Station, the largest trading hub in the Outer Rim, station manager Vex noticed it first in his weekly shipping reports. The Terran cargo vessels, that had been regular visitors for the past decade, simply stopped coming. At first he thought it might be a temporary disruption, perhaps a trade dispute or a scheduling change. Where are the human ships? He asked his assistant, a nervous Felinian named Crix whose whiskers twitched when he was worried. They just stopped coming, sir. Crix replied, his cat-like ears flattening against his head. No cancellations, no explanations. They fulfilled their existing contracts and then nothing. Vex stared at the empty docking bays that had once hosted human freighters. Those ships had been remarkably efficient, always on time, always properly documented, always carrying exactly what their manifest claimed. Without them, cargo was backing up in the station's storage areas, and several smaller species who depended on human shipping were struggling to move their goods. Similar scenes played out across hundreds of stations and ports throughout the galaxy. Human vessels had been so reliable, so professional, that many port authorities had built their schedules around their punctuality. Now those schedules were falling apart, but the missing ships were only the beginning. On Nexus Prime, the capital world of the Drexonian Republic, Defense Minister Cole stood before a tactical display showing pirate activity in their outer systems. The red markers representing raider attacks had doubled in just 3 months. "How is this possible?" he demanded, his scaled fists clenching. "We have the same patrol schedules, the same defenses." His aide, a young Draxonian named Vel, pulled up personnel records on his datapad. "Sir, we lost our entire human security consulting team 6 months ago. They were responsible for coordinating patrol routes and analyzing attack patterns. Without their expertise," Cole's eyes narrowed. He had never paid much attention to the human consultants. They worked quietly in the background, filing reports and making suggestions that his military commanders usually followed without much thought. He had assumed any competent security officer could do the same job. He was learning how wrong he had been. The pattern repeated itself throughout the galaxy. Mining operations struggled without human engineers who had optimized their extraction processes. Medical facilities found themselves short-staffed after human doctors and researchers returned to Earth space. Even entertainment venues noticed the absence of human performers and artists who had become surprisingly popular across multiple species. In the assembly itself, the bureaucratic machinery began to grind more slowly than usual. Human clerks, translators, and administrative staff had formed a nearly invisible network that kept information flowing between the thousands of different departments and committees. Without them, documents went missing, translation errors became common, and important communications were delayed or lost entirely. Assembly Speaker Vorthak found himself dealing with a crisis that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. The assembly was becoming inefficient. Meetings ran longer as species struggled to communicate without human interpreters, who had become skilled at bridging cultural gaps. Committees missed deadlines because human staff members were no longer there to keep track of schedules and requirements. "Perhaps we should send a delegation to Earth," suggested Ambassador Jorak during a private meeting with other concerned delegates. "Ask them to reconsider their decision." But the hegemony representative, a proud insectoid creature named Zix, rejected the idea immediately. "We cannot show weakness by crawling after them like lost younglings. They chose to leave. Let them discover what life is like outside the Assembly's protection." Others nodded in agreement. The galaxy's major powers had too much pride to admit they might need humanity's help. They convinced themselves that any problems were temporary, that other species would step in to fill the gaps left by human withdrawal. Months passed, and the problems grew worse instead of better. On the frontier world of Gamma Centauri, colonists watched helplessly as their main fusion reactor began to fail. The human engineering team that had maintained it for 5 years was gone, and no one else seemed to understand its complex systems well enough to repair it. Local hegemony technicians tried their best, but each attempt only made the situation worse. "We need to contact Earth," insisted colony leader Nara, a pragmatic Andorian whose blue skin had grown pale with worry. "The humans designed this reactor, only they know how to fix it properly." But when they tried to send a message to human space, they received only an automated response. "The Terran Federation appreciates your interest. All requests for technical assistance should be directed through appropriate diplomatic channels." The problem was that there were no diplomatic channels. The Assembly had never established protocols for dealing with former members, because no species had ever left before. The humans had simply vanished from the galactic community, taking their expertise with them. Trade networks that had relied on human logistics began to collapse. The humans had been remarkably good at finding efficient shipping routes and negotiating fair prices between different species. Without their coordination, costs increased and delivery times stretched longer and longer. Some species tried to fill the void left by human merchants and transporters, but they lacked the humans' peculiar combination of skills. Humans had been honest in their dealings, something that was apparently rarer in galactic trade than most beings realized. They had also been remarkably adaptable, able to work with species whose biology and culture were completely different from their own. A Christek trader named Shard discovered this when he tried to expand his routes into former human territory. His first attempt to negotiate with the Zephyrians ended in disaster when he misunderstood their cultural cues and accidentally insulted their emperor. His second attempt to trade with the Void Dwellers failed when he could not adapt his ship's systems to work in their dark matter technology. How did the humans make this look so easy? He wondered aloud to his mate, his crystalline body flickering with frustrated colors. The answer was becoming clear to those paying attention. Humans had possessed a rare gift for understanding and working with other species. They had been natural, diplomats and mediators, able to find common ground where others saw only differences. As the first anniversary of humanity's departure approached, the galaxy was beginning to understand what they had lost. The assembly still existed, but it felt hollow somehow, like a great machine missing some of its most important parts. In the corridors and meeting halls where Sarah Chen had once walked, delegates began to whisper questions that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. What were the humans doing now? Had they formed their own government? Were they trading with other species outside the assembly? Most disturbing of all, were they better off without the galaxy than the galaxy was without them? The questions multiplied, but answers were hard to come by. Human space had gone quiet, protected by defensive fleets that politely but firmly turned away all non-human vessels. The few species who had maintained friendly relationships with Earth found their diplomatic messages answered with courteous but non-committal responses. It was as if humanity had simply moved on, leaving the galaxy to figure out how to function without them, and as the months passed, it became increasingly clear that the galaxy was struggling with that task more than anyone had expected. The silence from human space grew heavier each day, filled with implications that no one in the assembly wanted to acknowledge. For the first time in millennia, the galaxy's greatest governing body was beginning to wonder if they had made a mistake. But pride, as always, prevented them from admitting it. The reckoning 2 years had passed since humanity walked away from the assembly, and the galaxy faced its greatest crisis in centuries. The Void Plague, as the medical community had named it, spread through space like wildfire through dry grass. It jumped from species to species with terrifying ease, killing some beings while leaving others as carriers who spread it further without knowing. The plague had started in the Outer Rim, in the same lawless regions where pirates and slavers operated beyond the assembly's reach. By the time anyone realized how dangerous it was, infected ships had already carried it to dozens of star systems. In the assembly's emergency session, delegates wore protective suits and maintained careful distances from each other. Even with all the precautions, several species had already lost significant portions of their populations. The medical analysis is complete, announced Dr. Keth, the Assembly's chief health officer. His normally steady voice shook as he read the report. The plague adapts to each species it encounters. Our best medical teams estimate it will spread to every inhabited system within 18 months if we cannot find a way to stop it. The hall filled with the sounds of panic in a dozen different languages. Clicks, roars, whistles, and electronic tones created a symphony of fear that no translator could properly convey. What about a cure? Demanded the hegemony representative. Surely our combined medical knowledge can find a solution. Dr. Keth's expression grew even more grim. We have formed a joint research committee with representatives from every major medical institution in the galaxy. Progress has been limited. The disease adapts faster than we can study it. How long do we have? Asked Ambassador Jorak, his bear-like features heavy with worry. At current infection rates, most core worlds will be affected within 6 months, Dr. Keth replied. The plague appears to spread faster in areas with heavy interstellar traffic. The assembly speaker called for order, but panic was already spreading through the chamber. Some delegates were demanding immediate quarantines of their home systems. Others insisted on forming research subcommittees to study the problem. A few species announced they were withdrawing their ships from all trade routes until the crisis passed. We need to coordinate our response, the speaker insisted. Form a unified plan of action. But even as the words left its mouth, delegates were already filing out of the chamber. The assembly's traditional approach of slow, careful deliberation was useless against a threat that moved at the speed of interstellar commerce. While the assembly debated and formed committees, disturbing reports began filtering in from intelligence networks throughout the galaxy. The information was fragmentary at first, just rumors and whispered conversations in spaceports and trading stations. But as more pieces came together, a picture emerged that shocked even the most experienced intelligence officers. Humanity had not simply disappeared after leaving the assembly. They had been busy. Captain Thex of Hegemony Intelligence stood before a holographic display showing the latest confirmed sightings of human activities. His insectoid features remained impassive, but his internal organs buzzed with concern as he briefed his superiors. According to our sources, the humans have established something called the Terran Federation, he reported. It includes not only human colonies but also several minor species who have apparently left the assembly to join them. Which species? Demanded General Voss, the Hegemony's military commander. The Alari communes, the Centauri Republic, and the free worlds of Tau Ceti, Thex replied. Additionally, intelligence suggests that at least 12 other minor species have opened diplomatic relations with this federation. The room fell silent. Those species had been assembly members for centuries, but they were small civilizations that rarely spoke up in assembly debates. Most of the major powers had barely noticed their existence. "What are the humans offering them?" asked General Voss. "Protection and prosperity," Thex answered simply. "And apparently, they are delivering on both promises." More disturbing still were the reports coming from the Zephyrian Empire. The same slavers whose activities had prompted humanity's departure from the assembly were facing a systematic campaign that was dismantling their operations piece by piece. General Hasek, the reptilian commander who had mocked Sarah Chen 2 years earlier, found himself dealing with a crisis that threatened the foundation of his empire. Slave ships were disappearing without a trace. Auction houses were being destroyed by unknown attackers. Even heavily defended slave colonies were somehow being liberated overnight. "Who is doing this?" he roared at his intelligence officers, his yellow eyes blazing with fury. "The attacks are too coordinated to be random pirate raids," replied his chief analyst, a nervous young Zephyrian named Sisk. "But we cannot identify the attackers. They use no known technology signatures, leave no survivors among our forces, and evacuate all slaves before we can respond." Hasek's claws scraped against the metal of his command chair. "What about our allies in the assembly? Surely they will provide assistance." Sisk's expression grew even more uncomfortable. "General, the assembly has referred our requests for aid to the Committee for External Affairs. They estimate a response within 6 to 8 months. The Zephyrian general stared at his aide in disbelief. His empire was being systematically destroyed, and the assembly wanted to study the matter for half a year before responding. Meanwhile, throughout the galaxy, other species were beginning to receive unexpected visitors. Ships bearing the symbol of the Terran Federation appeared in systems that had never seen humans before. But these were not the familiar cargo vessels or passenger transports that everyone remembered. These were sleek, efficient vessels that radiated quiet confidence. The Federation ships carried medical supplies to plague-affected worlds, but only to systems that requested assistance. They offered no explanations and asked for nothing in return. When local authorities tried to detain them for questioning, the ships simply left without causing any trouble. On Kepler Station, Manager Vex watched from his office window as a Federation medical ship docked at his station. The vessel was unlike anything he had seen before, smooth and organic-looking, as if it had been grown rather than built. The ship's captain was human, a woman with graying hair and calm eyes who introduced herself as Dr. Martinez. She carried medical supplies that were desperately needed on several plague-affected worlds in the region. "We heard about the crisis," she explained simply when Vex asked why they had come. "We thought we could help." "The assembly has medical teams working on the problem," Vex replied, though he could not keep the doubt out of his voice. Dr. Martinez nodded politely. "I'm sure they are doing their best. But in the meantime, people are dying. We have treatments that can help manage the symptoms and slow the spread." She left the medical supplies and departed without asking for payment or signing any treaties, but her parting words stayed with Vex long after her ship had jumped to hyperspace. "The offer stands for anyone who needs help," she had said. "All they have to do is ask." As reports of Federation activities spread throughout the galaxy, a disturbing pattern became clear. The humans were not just surviving outside the assembly, they were thriving. Worse, they were helping others thrive as well, but only those who came to them directly. Species that had dismissed humanity as young and inexperienced were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The humans had learned from their time in the assembly. They had seen what worked and what did not work in galactic governance, and they had built something better. The Federation moved with a speed and efficiency that made the assembly look like a bureaucratic dinosaur. When they identified a problem, they solved it. When they made promises, they kept them. When they offered help, it came without strings attached or political conditions. Most disturbing of all, they seemed genuinely uninterested in rejoining the assembly or seeking revenge against the species that had dismissed them. They had simply moved on, leaving the galaxy to struggle with problems that the Federation solved as a matter of routine. As the 3rd year since humanity's departure began, the galaxy watched with growing unease as more species quietly established diplomatic relations with the Terran Federation. The assembly still existed, still held its sessions and formed its committees. But increasingly, it felt like an echo of something that had once been important. The humans had not just left the, assembly. They had left it behind, and the galaxy was beginning to understand what that truly meant. The New Order 5 years after humanity's departure from the assembly, the galaxy had changed in ways that would have been unimaginable to the delegates who had once dismissed Sarachen's warnings. The Terran Federation had grown from a handful of human colonies into a significant power that commanded respect throughout the galaxy. The Federation now included 47 member species, ranging from the technologically advanced Centauri Republic to primitive worlds that had just discovered space travel. What united them was not technology or military strength, but a shared commitment to decisive action and mutual support. Admiral Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Federation flagship Determination, watching the tactical display that showed the current state of galactic politics. The blue zones represented Federation space, which had grown to encompass nearly a quarter of the inhabited galaxy. The red zones showed assembly territory, which had shrunk as more species chose to leave the ancient Confederation. The yellow zones showed unclaimed space, regions where neither the Federation nor the Assembly held authority. These areas had become increasingly dangerous as the Assembly's influence waned, and local conflicts erupted without any mediating authority. "Admiral, we're receiving distress signals from the Nexus system," reported Commander Park, the ship's communications officer. "Pirate fleets are attacking civilian shipping lanes." Elena studied the tactical display. The Nexus system sat at the border between Federation and Assembly space, technically under Assembly jurisdiction, but practically undefended. The Assembly's response to such attacks typically involved forming a committee to study the situation, while pirates continued their raids unimpeded. "What's the Assembly doing about it?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "According to our intelligence sources, they've referred the matter to the Committee for Border Security," Commander Park replied. "Estimated response time is 4 to 6 months. Elena nodded grimly. 4 to 6 months was an eternity when civilian ships were being captured and their crews sold into slavery. The Assembly's procedural approach might have worked in a galaxy where crises developed slowly, but the modern galaxy moved too fast for such deliberation. "Set course for the Nexus system," she ordered. "Signal the other ships in our task force to follow." "Admiral, that system is technically Assembly territory," warned her tactical officer, a Centauri named Vex, whose species had joined the Federation 3 years earlier. "Intervening could be seen as an act of aggression." Elena turned to look at him directly. "Commander Vex, how many civilian ships have been attacked in that system this week?" 17 confirmed, Admiral. "At least 400 casualties." "And how many has the Assembly saved?" Vex's expression grew uncomfortable. "None, Admiral." Elena returned her attention to the tactical display. "Then someone needs to act. Signal the pirate fleets on all frequencies. Tell them they have 1 hour to release their captives and withdraw from the system. After that, we will consider them hostile." The Federation task force jumped to hyperspace, leaving behind a galaxy that was still learning to cope with humanity's new approach to problem-solving. Unlike the Assembly's endless debates, the Federation's response was swift and decisive. Unlike the Assembly's toothless resolutions, the Federation's warnings carried real consequences. 1 hour after Admiral Vasquez's ultimatum, the pirate fleets discovered what those consequences looked like. Federation warships emerged from hyperspace, with a precision that spoke of countless hours of training and coordination. The pirates found themselves surrounded before they could react. The battle, such as it was, lasted 12 minutes. Federation ships used advanced tactics and superior coordination to disable the pirate vessels without destroying them. The captured pirates were given a choice: face justice in Federation courts, or be returned to their home systems to face whatever punishment awaited them there. Most chose Federation justice. Word had spread throughout the criminal underworld that Federation prisons, while strict, were fair and focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment. Criminals who served their time in Federation facilities often emerged as productive citizens, a concept that seemed impossible to many species. The rescued civilians were another matter entirely. They included representatives from 7 different species, including several from Assembly worlds. As Federation medical teams treated their injuries and trauma counselors helped them recover from their ordeal, many expressed a desire to immigrate to Federation space. "Why?" asked Dr. Sarah Kim, the Federation's chief diplomatic officer, during interviews with the rescued civilians. "Because you came for us," replied Jorak, an elderly merchant whose cargo ship had been captured 3 days earlier. "The Assembly would have formed a committee to study our situation. You actually did something about it." Similar scenes were playing out across the galaxy as the Federation's influence continued to expand. But it was not military conquest that drove the Federation's growth. Instead, species joined voluntarily, attracted by the promise of competent governance and mutual protection. The Federation's approach to membership was radically different from the Assembly's traditional model. New members were not required to adopt Federation laws or customs. Instead, they were asked to commit to three basic principles: no slavery, no aggression against other members, and participation in mutual defense agreements. Within those broad guidelines, member species were free to govern themselves however they chose. The Federation provided coordination and support, but did not impose its will on local governments. This approach had proven remarkably successful, as species discovered they could maintain their cultural independence while benefiting from Federation protection and trade networks. The Assembly, meanwhile, continued to struggle with its traditional, bureaucratic approach. The Void Plague crisis had finally been resolved, but only after Federation medical teams had quietly shared treatment protocols with Assembly worlds. The Assembly's own research committees had spent 2 years studying the problem before producing any useful results. Even more embarrassing was the complete collapse of the Zephyrian slave trade. The empire that had defied the Assembly for decades had been systematically dismantled by Federation forces operating with surgical precision. Former slave worlds were now thriving under Federation protection, while Zephyrian military leaders faced war crimes tribunals that the Assembly had never been able to organize. General Hasek himself had been captured during the liberation of Zephyr Prime, the Empire's capital world. His trial had been broadcast throughout the galaxy, providing clear evidence of the atrocities he had committed. The Assembly delegates who had spent years debating whether to intervene were forced to watch as the Federation delivered justice with swift efficiency. How did they do it so quickly? Wondered Ambassador Jorak during a private conversation with other Assembly delegates who had opposed slavery but been unable to act within the system. The answer came from intelligence reports that painted a picture of an organization that bore little resemblance to the struggling human delegation that had once pleaded for Assembly action. The Federation operated with military precision but humanitarian goals, combining efficiency with moral clarity in ways that the Assembly had never managed. More disturbing still were the reports of species requesting to leave the Assembly to join the Federation. The requests were always polite and formal, following proper diplomatic procedures, but they represented a hemorrhaging of members that threatened the Assembly's very existence. The Drexonian Republic had been the most shocking departure. As one of the Assembly's founding members, their decision to join the Federation had sent ripples of alarm throughout the galactic community. Their announcement had been brief and to the point. The Federation offers what the Assembly promises, but cannot deliver: competent governance and effective protection. Other departures followed. The Mindari Collective, the Crystalline Hegemony, the United Worlds of Arcturus. Each departure weakened the Assembly's authority and strengthened the Federation's position. Assembly Speaker Vorthak found itself presiding over an organization that was becoming irrelevant. Member species still attended sessions, but increasingly, they seemed to be going through the motions rather than addressing real problems. The important decisions were being made elsewhere, in Federation councils that actually had the power and will to act. Perhaps we should consider reforms, suggested one delegate during a particularly poorly attended session. Streamline our procedures, reduce bureaucratic delays. But even that modest proposal was referred to a committee for study. The Assembly was trapped in its own traditions, unable to change even when change was clearly necessary for survival. As the Federation celebrated its 5th anniversary, the galaxy watched with a mixture of admiration and concern. The humans had not just succeeded outside the Assembly, they had created something that worked better than the Assembly itself. More troubling still, they seemed content to let the Assembly continue its decline without interference. The Federation was not interested in conquest or domination. They offered membership to any species that wanted to join, but they did not pressure anyone to make that choice. They helped solve problems when asked, but they did not impose solutions on unwilling recipients. The choice. The invasion came without warning, as the devourers always preferred. They emerged from the dark spaces between galaxies, creatures of living shadow and corrupted metal that consumed everything in their path. For 1,000 years, they had been nothing more than scary stories told to frighten young beings across the galaxy. Now they were real, and they were hungry. The first worlds to fall were on the outer rim, isolated colonies with minimal defenses. The attackers moved like a plague of locusts, stripping worlds bare of all biological matter before moving on to their next target. Within days, 17 star systems had gone silent, their populations either consumed or converted into more devourers. In the assembly emergency session, panic filled the Great Hall as delegates struggled to comprehend the scale of the threat. The creatures that attacked bore no resemblance to any known species. They seemed to exist only to consume and multiply, turning their victims into additional soldiers for their ever-growing army. Our military analysts estimate the enemy force at approximately 50 million vessels, reported General Koss, the Assembly's supreme military commander. His voice remained steady, but his hands shook as he delivered the briefing. They appear to be completely focused on biological matter. They consume all life they encounter and use it to create more of themselves. The hall erupted in chaos as delegates demanded immediate action. But even in the face of galactic extinction, the Assembly's traditional procedures remained in place. "We must form a defense committee," declared the Speaker, its tree-like arms waving frantically. "Coordinate responses among all member species. Establish unified command structures." "How long will that take?" demanded the Draxonian representative, one of the few major species still remaining in the Assembly. "Following proper procedures, approximately 6 to 8 weeks, replied the Speaker. A stunned silence filled the hall. 6 to 8 weeks to organize a response while the enemy consumed entire worlds in a matter of hours. Even the most devoted believers in Assembly procedures could see the insanity of such a timeline. Ambassador. Jorek rose from his platform, his bear-like features grim with determination. "We need Federation assistance. They have the military capability and organizational efficiency to respond to this threat." The suggestion triggered an explosion of outrage from the remaining major powers. Pride and stubborn refusal to admit weakness had brought the Assembly to this point, and even the threat of extinction could not overcome ingrained arrogance. "We cannot go begging to the humans like helpless children," declared the hegemony representative. "The Assembly has defended the galaxy for 4,000 years. We can handle this crisis without outside assistance." But even as the delegates argued, reports continued to arrive of more worlds falling to the devourer advance. The enemy showed no interest in negotiation or diplomacy. They simply consumed everything in their path and moved on to the next target. 27 systems had fallen by the time the Assembly finally authorized military action. The response was everything that critics had come to expect from the ancient institution: slow, poorly coordinated, and hampered by competing agendas among different species. The first major battle took place in the Kepler system, where Assembly forces attempted to make a stand against the devourer advance. 15 different species contributed ships to the defense, but their various technologies and tactical doctrines proved impossible to integrate effectively. Communications broke down, supply lines became confused, and unit commanders argued over strategy even as the enemy approached. The battle was a disaster. Assembly forces were overwhelmed in less than 6 hours, their ships consumed by the seemingly endless swarm of devourer vessels. The survivors who managed to escape brought horrifying reports of creatures that seemed to learn and adapt from each encounter, becoming more dangerous with every battle. News of the defeat spread panic throughout Assembly space. More species began evacuating their border worlds, creating a refugee crisis that the Assembly was completely unprepared to handle. The ancient confederation that had governed the galaxy for millennia was collapsing under the weight of its own inability to respond effectively to crisis. Then, as the Devourer fleet prepared to strike at the Assembly's core worlds, something unexpected happened. Federation ships appeared in the threatened systems, not as conquerors or saviors, but as protectors responding to a galactic emergency. The Federation's response was everything the Assemblies had not been: swift, coordinated, and devastatingly effective. Federation fleets moved with precision that spoke of careful planning and superior training. Their ships used advanced technologies and tactics that seemed specifically designed to counter the Devourer threat. More importantly, the Federation treated the crisis as exactly that: a crisis requiring immediate action rather than careful deliberation. Within hours of their arrival, Federation forces had established defensive perimeters around threatened worlds and begun systematic strikes against Devourer formations. The battle for New Geneva, one of the Assembly's most important core worlds, became a textbook example of the difference between the two approaches. Assembly defenders had spent 3 days arguing over tactical deployment while the Devourer fleet approached. Federation reinforcements arrived just as the enemy entered the system and immediately engaged without waiting for committee approval. Admiral Vasquez commanded the Federation response from the bridge of the Determination, coordinating 17 different task forces with an efficiency that amazed the Assembly observers. Her ships moved like parts of a single organism, supporting each other and adapting to enemy tactics in real time. Target the central coordination nodes, she ordered as Federation sensors identified the command structure within the devourer swarm. Cut off their ability to coordinate, and they become just individual predators. The battle raged for 18 hours, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Federation forces had studied every report from the earlier encounters and developed specific countermeasures for devourer tactics. When the enemy tried to adapt, the Federation adapted faster. By the time the last devourer ship was destroyed, the galaxy had witnessed something unprecedented, the complete and decisive defeat of an enemy that had seemed unstoppable just days earlier. Similar victories followed in system after system as Federation forces pushed the invasion back toward the galactic rim. The creatures that had terrified the galaxy for weeks were systematically hunted down and destroyed by an enemy that refused to be intimidated or consumed. The final battle took place in the dark space between galaxies where Federation ships pursued the last Devourer fleet to its source. What they found there would remain classified for decades, but the invasion ended as suddenly as it had begun. When Admiral Vasquez returned to Federation space, she found a galaxy transformed by recent events. The Assembly still existed, but its authority had been completely shattered. More than half of its remaining members had formally requested to join the Federation, while others had simply declared independence and established their own governments. The few species that remained loyal to the Assembly faced a harsh reality. Their ancient confederation had failed its most important test. When the galaxy needed protection, the Assembly had offered committees. When worlds needed saving, the Assembly had offered procedures. The Federation had offered results. President Sarah Chen, formerly Ambassador Chen, stood before the Federation Council as it prepared to address the post-invasion galaxy. The woman who had once pleaded with the Assembly for action now commanded the respect of hundreds of species who had seen what effective leadership looked like. "The Devourer threat is ended," she announced to the assembled delegates. "But the galaxy faces a choice about its future. The old ways of governance have proven inadequate for the challenges we face. We can continue with the failed system that brought us to the brink of extinction, or we can build something better." The formal request came 3 days later. The remaining Assembly leadership, humbled by their complete failure during the crisis, sent a delegation to Federation space. They came not as equals seeking alliance, but as supplicants requesting aid. Speaker Vorthak led the delegation, its tree-like form somehow diminished by the weight of recent events. "The Assembly formally requests admission to the Terran Federation," it announced in a voice that shook with either emotion or exhaustion. President Chen received the delegation in the same chamber where humanity had once been denied justice for the Zephyrian slave trade. The irony was not lost on anyone present, but there was no gloating in the president's response. "The Federation welcomes any species that wishes to join us," she said simply, "but we cannot admit the Assembly as an institution. That organization represents everything we sought to escape: bureaucracy without accountability, procedure without purpose, governance without the ability to govern." She gestured to the holographic display that showed the current state of the galaxy. Blue zones representing Federation space now covered more than 3/4 of inhabited systems. The remaining yellow zones showed independent worlds that had chosen neither Federation nor Assembly membership. "Individual species are welcome to join the Federation if they accept our basic principles," President Chen continued.